Welcome to Miniature Painting. Today we're going to talk about airbrushing and airbrushes. So I wasn't originally going to do this video today, but whenever I watch live streams, Q&As, things like that, I see lots and lots of questions about airbrushes. So it seems to be one of those things that people are interested in and there's an audience for. So I figured I would give my own personal take, my own personal history on my airbrush and what I use it for. So, you know, airbrushing and picking up an airbrush is one of those things that I wish I had done earlier in my hobby and career. As you progress, there's several things that you wish you had learned about or taken up earlier. So my top three are using a bigger brush, not just using a detail brush for everything, using a wet palette, and using an airbrush. I had lots of reasons for not using an airbrush, but looking back, they were all just excuses. So back when I had just started really getting into the hobby, I was playing 40K with a friend and saw some of his painting. I asked, I don't remember what the particular effect was, but I said, hey, how did you do that? He said, oh, yeah, I used an airbrush. And I just instantly assumed, oh, well, that's expensive. That's going to be too expensive. I'm not going to get one of those. And later on, as I got more experience and tried out new techniques, I had some new excuses that I added to my repertoire about things that were really just assumptions. Like didn't know all that much about it, so I had a lot of assumptions about airbrushes. And so the big one was, well, I actually want to learn the technique. Using an airbrush is just cheating. I want to learn how to do it with a brush. And that's really a ridiculous excuse. In any other hobby, if someone were to pick up a particular tool for that hobby, nobody claims that they're cheating. If you enjoy working on cars and you go out and pick up a pneumatic wrench set, nobody's like, that's cheating. Or if you like carpentry and you go out and buy a table saw, nobody's like, cheater, why don't you learn how to actually cut wood, right? So having that mentality when it comes to our hobby is just equally ridiculous. An airbrush is a tool. A brush, it's a type of brush. And so it has its uses, and it should be looked at from that point of view. Just because you have this tool, it doesn't become a magic wand. You can't just be like, airbrush them and like just, oh, hey, look, I did stuff without learning anything. Cool. You can't just magically do anything. It's a new tool, so it takes training, it takes hours of practice in order to make sure you're good at it. Just because you have an airbrush doesn't make you an expert at blending or an expert at anything. It just means that you own this thing. So the second thing I thought was a reason, but was really an excuse, was size, or all included complexity. I didn't know what all went into it. I thought I need to go buy a compressor, I need to buy all this stuff. I thought, you needed to have a large style compressor, a real compressor, the one that you would have for like a shop or woodworking. And yet again, that's not true. As with anything in this hobby, it can be rather small and unassuming, or it can be as big and grandiose as you want. So after doing a little bit of research, I decided to pull the trigger and I got one. I went on Amazon, found an inexpensive set with a compressor, a brush, hose that connects them, a few other things. And I just went for it. And what really pushed me into doing it, in addition to seeing that it wasn't that expensive, was that my hobby was starting to get stalled out for, I'm going to say, reasons. Okay? Lots of reasons, but they all really tied into the priming. So I put some models together and then I'd say, well, I can't go out with a rattle can because it's raining. Or, okay, well, I can't go out with a rattle can because of whatever. It's too humid, it's too cold, it's too windy. I only have one model I want to paint right now, and that's a waste of a rattle can, because it is, truthfully. I'd put models together, and priming was always the bottleneck. So I'd find excuses, delays, but with an airbrush, I can prime a single model at a time. It's on my desk, so as soon as, or the airbrush is on my desk, so as soon as I finish assembling a model to where it gets to the point where it needs to be primed, I can prime it and I can go forward with my life. So I started off really just to prime models. Excuse me. So I started off really just to prime models, but I found out. So I found this one that wasn't expensive since I was just learning. I went with the lower priced one because in my mind, if you're learning to ride a bike, or if you're riding a bike and you decide that you want to go buy your first car, you don't go out and buy a Ferrari. Your training model should be less expensive in case you break it, or maybe you pick it up and you find that you hate it. You do it a little bit and you're like, blue, 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 blue. You give it the old college try, and you're like, well, this is going in the dumpster. I hate that. Right? So it's if you decide you don't like it, then if you wasted a whole lot of money on it, then you feel terrible about that. So, some people, they got to get the top of the line the first time they buy something. That's not me. I'd rather go less expensive and then upgrade when I know what I like and as my skill level has grown. So I had this small compressor, and it works fine. It doesn't have a moisture trap. It doesn't have a pressure gauge. It has a regulator, this screwing part right here. And where I was living, there wasn't a whole lot of humidity in the air, so not having a moisture trap wasn't a big deal. For the regulator, since it didn't have a pressure gauge, I used feel. I'd kind of see how the paint came out. I had a piece of paper out, and I was like, okay, it looks good, and then I'd do it on the model. So that's how I determined pressure and got to where I wanted it. It's also very small, and because of that, I didn't need a big hobbying space. So I first started airbrushing on a coffee table. I sat on my couch and just playing with the motion, the trigger, learning how to use it, and just spraying a piece of paper. Once I was spraying models and I decided I was ready for that, I decided to go and I used my kitchen island. I didn't have a dedicated painting space set up in a new house that I had gotten, so I just used the kitchen island and I was priming models. So, and that's one of the good parts about an airbrush. They are relatively small. If you have it set up in an office, that's great because then the compressor never moves. But if you're like, hey, I feel like painting on on my couch, or hey, I'm going to be staying in a hotel for a week for work or whatever, it's not that big. As long as you have electricity and paint and something to paint, then you can use it. So, downside to this particular unit is that, it's relatively small. It has a small pressure range. They say it goes up to 50 psi, which I don't personally believe, but it's you have to take that into account when you decide what you're going to paint with, right? It's really good at inks and it's really good at pushing metallics. It does fine with primers and base coating as long as it's relatively thin. I started using a lot of white and it was giving me difficulty, and so that's when I decided to upgrade. So once you do decide to upgrade, a lot of people are all about upgrading the airbrush themselves. They're like, hey, I got to go out and get a Badger, da da da, blah blah blah, right? Whatever. I got to get 6 airbrushes, and that's fine. Um, I don't agree with that, based on what I started with. So if I had gone out and gotten a brand new airbrush and still used this compressor, it wouldn't have done anything for me. So this basic tube is really the same. The idea of almost every airbrush is the same, assuming it's gravity fed and a dual action trigger. They're all pretty much going to be the exact same idea. The and some of them have some more rigots. They have tighter controls, things like that. But for me, I found that I needed to upgrade my compressor first. And no matter how nice the airbrushes you have, if you have a lower level compressor, it's just not going to be able to keep up with you. So what I did is I traded this. Well, I didn't trade it in, obviously. I still have it. But I decided to go with this one. So, as you can see, it's a little bit bigger. Still, relatively small. Can pick it up with my hands. It's not a shop compressor. It's not a big one that you might use with, say, woodworking or things like that. Although if you happen to have one of those, you have a lot of pneumatic tools or whatever, you can actually use one of those with an airbrush. I wouldn't have one inside because they're kind of loud, but you could hook it in through a bunch of regulators, and you can actually use an airbrush using a 200-pound, 400-pound air compressor as long as it's regulated down to the right pressure range. So as you can see on this one does not have a tank. It is just the compressor. Has the regulator with an attached moisture trap. It has pressure gauge, and it's everything that I need. So when I bought this at a craft store. I think it was Michael's, maybe it was probably Hobby Lobby. But you can get them on Amazon now for like $170, just this, with a couple of hoses and various attachments and things like that. And this should last until the day I die, assuming I treat it correctly. This unit here with the airbrush and everything else is available on Amazon right now for right around $40. So you can get started airbrushing for around $40. Okay. So the one thing that did not come with, that the other one did, is the pressure trap, or the moisture trap, as I said. So these are actually pretty important. If you live somewhere that has just no humidity, then great, you don't really need one. But if you live anywhere where relative humidity gets high, if anybody's ever like, ugh, it's humid, then you probably need one. So the way this basically works is that the air comes in from this side, flows around. The droplets of water can't make some of these turns because they're bigger. And then when it comes out, it comes out through there. And then in order to get the water out that accumulates while it's running and there's pressure on it, you push up on here and it's able to blow that water out. Okay. This also has a regulator with the pressure gauge, so that's always nice. So you should always have one of these on, as I said, on your airbrush, assuming you live somewhere where it gets relatively humid, because when you have humidity in the air, the compression action of your compressor actually acts like a sponge, or on a sponge. It will squeeze it and water comes out. And then those droplets of water will actually flow along the tubing. And if you have an airbrush that does not have a tank, those droplets of water will actually cause impingement damage to various parts along your air system and to the airbrush itself. The water droplets are relatively heavy and can damage components, but also the water inside of it will get added into your paint mixture. So you'll mix up your paint in the pot, but then the air coming through will also have water in it, so it will actually just really ruin your paint mixture. You'll be like, why does it look this way? It doesn't look right. And it's because of the moisture. Now, some people say that if you have an air compressor with a tank, you don't need a moisture trap. That's actually not true. It is true that the tank itself acts a bit as a moisture trap, but unfortunately, because of that, that can cause more damage to your compressor and tank unit itself. So the tank has a set amount. Let's say this is a tank, right, with the compressor on top. It has all this volume of space where the compressed air would be. Well, if it fills up with water, it has less space for the actual compressed air, and so the compressor has to run more often because you're using the available air. And so because of that, you're more likely to get some kind of problem with your motor, compressor motor, or the compressor itself. Most likely thing that I usually see with that is that you have a winding go bad, you have a ground on a winding. And so the you end up getting that, and you'll have to just replace the whole thing. Also, if a tank is full of water, they do corrode out. I used to do useful life analysis on compressed air tanks, and one of the biggest reasons was water damage due to corrosion. So, yeah, if you do have a style that has a attached tank to it, make sure that you drain the water out periodically. Obviously, that depends on you and where you live, but just make sure it doesn't fill up with water. So now the airbrush itself, the way that this works is pretty simple. Air comes in through here. Now this is obviously a gravity fed one. So air will come in through here and actually shoots out. So this particular, the double action trigger, if we push in to the airbrush, that's just air. And then when you pull back, that's paint. Okay? So you have some mixture of the two, some mixture of pushing in and pulling back that gets you the air and paint ratio that you're looking for. And then as the air comes out, it actually creates a low pressure system right here through what's called a Venturi nozzle. And anyway, when you open up the needle, it sucks the paint out. So that's why you end up needing to have the right viscosity for what you're trying to do in order to make sure that it comes out. If you just throw a thick craft paint into here, nothing's going to happen with our normal pressure ranges that we use. You could bump up the pressure to get really high, but that may not be what you want. So you can really airbrush with anything as long as you have the pressure high enough. I mean, sandblasting is basically airbrushing just with sand. So now these needles can be changed out. I don't remember what size needle this came with, but this has a 0.3 millimeter. I find that to be a good size. It gives relative control and then also can cover a lot more of the model at one time. Some, you can find ones that go up to like 0.5, some people use 0.4. They have a 0.2 for when you want to do a lot of detail, but it's just, you're more likely to get clogs and you have to make sure that your paint is really thin. So the next part, I'm going to show how I actually use airbrush a little bit, and then also changing out colors, because that's one of the reasons too that a lot of people don't want to get an airbrush is they think that, well, hey, I have black in here, well, now I want to paint with white. It's going to take 20 minutes to clean the airbrush, or whatever number they assign it in their head, but it's actually relatively quick. So I'll show you that in just one second. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to start off with zenithal priming just this one. I'm going to call it a model. Obviously you can see this is a toy from McDonald's, Whack Arnold's, wherever. So I like using some of these kinds of things for practicing. They'll actually give you these models if you just ask for these toys if you just ask for them. But that allows you to practice some techniques if you're something you really want to focus on. Also, these types of things actually make really good terrain. It kind of looks like a statue, and you get it painted to how you want it to look, and then it can just be a statue somewhere on your tree. Okay, so I'm going to actually turn on the airbrush so you can hear what it sounds like. That's it. So I have pressure relatively high. It's sitting at around 25 when it's static and right around 18 while it's running. So I'm going to actually turn it down just a skosh. Okay. So as you can hear, it's actually not that loud. If you had a shop style compressor, it would be quite a bit louder. But so the things that I have on I always have an airbrush hanger just to put my airbrush on. This is a style where you can actually also like blow into it. A cup to put used paint in. This is just a bottle of water. This is just regular tap water. And then I have Vallejo airbrush thinner, black primer, gray primer, and white primer. You could do this. This is just an example, so you can replace those in your mind with really whatever. Just think of paint. Okay? So when you start off with your airbrush, you always want to put in a couple of drops of thinner, no matter what it is that you're actually, just enough to cover the bottom. Okay. These primers are relatively thin, but they're get thicker as they get whiter. So just kind of put some in. Now, some people would be mad about mixing in the cup, but hey, whatever. Just for example. Okay, I'll probably put just a little bit more primer in. There we go. Or a little bit more thinner. All right. Then when you have it in there, you can kind of swirl it around, and you can put your finger over the edge and do the air and pull back on the needle, and you'll see that it actually mixes inside the cup. Okay, great. Some styles of airbrush actually have holes here on the sides. I don't know why they do that, but I've found that if you do have one of those styles, you can make a guard using something like blue tack, and then you can actually still do the back flushing technique like that. Okay, so we're going to start with just air, pull back on the needle. A little bit of spackling, so put the pressure, it's a little too high. Actually, a little bit too low. Okay, so we're going to start off with just doing this gal. You know her name. I don't care. I'm sure my kids know it, but it's one of them. So you should see that I actually have, when I'm using the airbrush, I'm pulling back just a little bit. You never want to pull the needle past more than about halfway. So you start with just air, pull the needle back some amount, and then finish with just air. And that helps to kind of dry it off to keep the air or the paint from being wet for too long. So move up the legs. And sometimes, just like with the rattle can, you might need more than one coat. In this case, I'm doing what's called what's called a zenithal prime. I got it. So it will, they'll probably explain better in a later video. But the good part about airbrushing is that it dries so quickly you can go almost straight into your second coat. See, whenever I used a rattle can, you know, I just have to throw it outside, come up, every time it seemed like I had to come up with a new contraption in order to prime things, you know, blue tack into a box, make up a paint stick, just whatever. And then it's always felt like an all-day thing. Like I'd go outside, I'd do it, I'd be waiting for it to dry, so I'd come back later, and then, oh, well, missed a spot, I guess I'll just have to do a second coat, and then, you know, yeah, it just always felt like a real pain compared to just using an airbrush. It's much quicker. Okay. So we're going to call that good for the prime. We're actually going to put 2 more coats on of other colors, so that's fine. So this is the part that kind of throws a lot of people off, is the cleaning it out. Don't mind the color in there. That's actually yellow ink. So you can see I have this left in here. People are like, well, I don't want to waste it. Really, compared to, if you think that, you know, if you want to do a whole bunch of them, obviously do them all in this, prime them all in the same color, then you can just keep using this. But the amount of actual paint in here is really not that much if you combine it with the thinner. So, okay. So you're just going to dump it out, all right? You're going to take some, this is just water again, swirl it around, do a little bit of back flushing, dump it out. And you're going to do that a total of 3 times. So swirl, back flush, dump, and then fill, swirl, back flush, dump. Okay, make sure you got it all out. Take just a paper towel to clean any of the dried on stuff on the top. Okay, and then just, so there should, when you look in there, you shouldn't really see anything, right? It should be pretty empty, and then you just blow out. Again, don't go past halfway, whatever is left in there. Okay. As you can see, it's clean as a whistle. Nothing. Okay, and that's it. So now, at the end of the day, when I'm done airbrushing for the entire day, yeah, you can take it apart and clean it. But for transferring between colors, it's actually pretty quick and painless. So, again, we'll do couple drops of thinner, some primer. Now there's going to be less to this one than there was of the black, just because of the nature of zenithal highlighting. But so with the zenithal, with this would be straight on at a 90 degree to the model. So, but I'm going to explain that later in a better video. Oops.
And the goal is in this case to cover up the black. So I'm getting a lot of what's called speckling. It's actually due to a few different things, but so you can have two different kind of things happen if your paint mixture isn't quite right. You either get this, which is speckling, where the paint is actually drying before it reaches the model, and it leaves these specks. In that case, there's if that happens, you can always move your airbrush a little bit closer to the model itself. Okay. Or you can modify your pressure, make your pressure a little bit lower, and then you just have to play with your paint mixture in your cup a little bit. Okay, so done with gray for right now. We're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to dump, swirl, backflush, dump. Okay, 3 times. And then finish spraying out here. Cool. And you see there's nothing coming off. Cool. So then next is going to be for white. White is the one that gives most people trouble. White is thicker due to some of the pigments that they use. So take a look. It's a little bit too thin. Add a little bit more white. Okay, so in this case it's going to be kind of straight on from the top up to around maybe a 5-degree angle. So, and that's pretty much that. Gonna do a little bit more on the plinth. All right. So, and then that was just white, right? the thing that gives most people, a lot of people trouble, not most people, but it does give people trouble. As long as you have the proper, you thin it correctly, and you can just do the same thing. You swirl, back flush, thump, water, swirl, back flush, dump. And third time is in fact the charm. Just a little paper towel. Get the dry stuff. Right. And then empty out whatever is in the line. The things that some people do is they empty out the cup by just blowing out all the paint, and you don't want to do that. You actually, in order to prevent getting tip dry and some other things, the things you want to do is put the least amount of paint through the airbrush as possible, which is a little counterintuitive because you obviously want to paint with it. But when you're done painting, just dump that stuff out. Don't run it through the airbrush, because then you're more likely to get tip dry and other things like that. So just use a little bit of air to, the other nice about an airbrush, you can just use a little bit of air to kind of assist in drying your model a little bit. So when you look at it from the top, it should look pretty white. When you look at it from the side, you can see a gradient of really white to really dark with some gray, right? And then if you look at it from the bottom, you can see, you should be able to see mostly black. In this case, it's this weird, this color too. Okay, and so that's the idea behind a zenithal highlight. But something you can also do with a rattle can, but obviously you'd have to have 3 cans, you go outside, you have to deal with all that garbage. So now, is an airbrush perfect? No, no. If your airbrush was perfect, they wouldn't sell regular brushes, right? So there's several situations where you, where it's not necessarily the best. If you're trying to do a whole lot of detail work, it's not the best tool for that. You can do detail work with an airbrush, and it can help with some blending over detail work later on. But if you're just trying to just do eyes, that ain't the best thing. Best thing is a brush. Obviously, if you don't have electricity, which I'm not sure how you're doing any brushing since you wouldn't have lights either, but assume you have lights but you just don't have any electricity, you obviously got to have the airbrush. Or, you know, if you do want to go on a trip and you want to take some brushes with you, you know, you could take a couple of brushes and a couple of bottles of paint and get everything else you need there. But, you know, if you have limited space, taking an airbrush somewhere with you might be difficult. So hopefully that answers a lot of questions that people have. That answers a bunch that I've seen online from other people about airbrushes. They don't know what to start with. They don't know how big it is, how expensive they are, what you can actually use them for. So hopefully that answers a lot of those questions. If you liked the video, you know, you can follow me on Instagram at mehminipaints, and also have a Facebook page at miniature painting, and throw me a like over there. Thanks.